Hello and welcome to this ARA webinar with staff from CPDA, the Council of Producers and Distributors of Agrotechnology, titled Adjuvant Advantage for the Sales Agronomist. Today's webinar will focus on the Endangered Species Act and provide insights on how to comply using a technical field guide. We would like to take this time to thank Winfield United for sponsoring today's webinar. My name is Hunter Carpenter, Senior Director of Government Affairs for ARA, and I'll introduce our webinar speakers in just a bit, but first I'll go over a few housekeeping items so you know what to expect. Webinars are an important part of the ARA professional development pathway and provide a great opportunity for ARA members, companies, to help educate their employees. Today's webinar will be recorded and added to the member-only ARA dashboard section of the website. As a reminder, you can log into the member-only dashboard to access past webinar recordings at any time. If you do not have an ARA login, you can email info@aradc.org to set one up. Questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation, but you can type them into the chat panel or Q&A function at any time. With that out of the way, I'm excited to introduce our speakers today, Greg Dahl and Bill Chisholm. Bill has over 45 years of experience in agriculture and pest management, and he grew up on a vegetable farm in the Salinas Valley of California and worked for the California Extension, a pesticide registrant, and retired after 32 years with the EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs. He received his PhD in weed science from Virginia Tech. Greg retired from Winfield United in December of 2023 following 40 years working for both the private and public sectors. He's currently serving as the president of the Weed Science Society of America and was president of the North Central Weed Science Society in 2017. He has been a certified crop advisor since 1998, with over 70 products have been brought to market from research by Greg and his team. Much of his research involves adjuvants and application technology. We would also like to acknowledge CPDA's advisory working group for all of their input in helping make this such a successful series of webinars for both ARA and CPDA. Following today's presentation, a QR code will be displayed for you to scan from your mobile device and earn 1 IPM continuing education credit as approved for by the certified crop advisors. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers.
So I wanted to provide you this information, which is a reminder of the information we provided in the last webinar. So in that webinar, we were talking about drift reduction adjuvants and deposition adjuvants. And when we're trying to make an application and we're going to try and comply with the Endangered Species Act, it's important to use the right size droplets. And the best way to do that is to pick the right nozzle that gives us the droplet spectrum that we're looking for. And so if we have contact things, we want things that have more fine size droplets or medium droplets. And then if we got systemic things or soil applied things or things like that, we're going to want to use droplets that give us much bigger, nozzles that give us much bigger droplets. And so the first thing we want to do is pick the right droplet, our right nozzle for the job. Having said all that, we want to use deposition adjuvants along with the nozzles to do a much better job of reducing off-target movement, getting more product where we actually want it to be, remove a lot of the fine spray particles. Those products will help us with our application to hit the target and not bounce off. And actually, I find that we actually recommend that we should use deposition adjuvants with every application, regardless of what tip we have. Next slide, please. So this is something we saw last webinar. If you look at the size of the bars, that indicates the amount of spray volume that is in droplets that are driftable fines. And we were using Roundup Power Max because we do get driftable fines with that. And if we look, we've got some nozzles on the left-hand side that are giving us medium-sized droplets. And then as we move all the way to the other side, we've got some nozzles that provide us very coarse droplets. And you can see as we move from the left to the right, we're getting less and less volume, spray volume that's in driftable fines. Now, if we look at the light green that's right next to the other one, that is when we've added a drift reduction adjuvant to it. And as you look across there, so we've got the dark green is the Roundup Power Max solution by itself. The light green is that solution with a DRA. We can see that across all of those nozzles, we get about 50% reduction in the spray volume that's made up of driftable fines. And so we want to do that so that we can comply with the endangered species program and get the job done that we want. Next slide. And then as we go into that, we recommend using CPDA certified adjuvants because they've been tested or verified. There's a lot of testing that we verify 17 different things. We do toxicity tests. We check the labels and the safety data sheets. We validate all of the adjuvant claims and the ingredients. And EPA, we need to do comply with certification requirements from EPA, DOT, OSHA, things like that. So there's a lot of things that are going on that have been verified when we use a CPDA certified adjuvant. Next slide. And so I want to focus your attention here on the red statement. EPA has allowed the manufacturers to put this statement on their labels. And it says when an adjuvant is to be used with this product, and then the name of the registrant is there, and then recommends the use of a Council of Producers and Distributors of Agri-Technology or CPDA certified adjuvant. And so that's actually on about 500 pesticide labels in the United States. So this is a well-designed program, and it's being used quite widely. And we are very proud of that. Next slide, please. Other way. There we go. So then this is actually a website. You can go to the CPDA website and you can find the CPDA certified adjuvants. And there's over 230 adjuvants that are CPDA certified adjuvants. And they're from a lot of different manufacturers. So you should be able to find a CPDA certified adjuvant that's available to you. With that, next slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Bill.
Thank you very much, Greg. And thanks for having me today. I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the Endangered Species Act. Next slide, please. The Endangered Species Act, I'll talk about the ESA, was signed into law in '73, and it provides for the conservation of threatened and endangered species and their critical habitats. All federal agencies must ensure their actions do not harm listed species. The EPA has tried to implement this several times, and this time I think they're going to pull it off. So the federal agencies involved are the EPA, which deals with the pesticides. Fish and Wildlife Service protects terrestrial and freshwater species. National Marine Fisheries Service protects saltwater species. Those two together are called the services in several pages of the statute. And then the USDA looks at the impacts of these mitigations. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the why and who. Why are we seeing the changes now? The ESA became a law in '73, as I said, but there was a mega lawsuit involving hundreds of pesticides recently settled in 2023. As part of that settlement, the EPA agreed to evaluate all future pesticide decisions and look at their impacts to endangered species. So the labels are going to come into compliance. State lead agencies are going to enforce those labels, and each state will decide the best way for them to enforce those. I get asked quite often whether this is going to go away. This is a federal law. Congress would have to change the law. And as I'm sorry to say, many years Congress can't even pass a budget. So I think changing the law would be very difficult. And in addition, many people want us to protect bald eagles, Florida manatees, monarch butterflies, etc. Next slide, please. Um, this slide, if you look at the top, there's 1,700 species on the endangered species list. Um, the larger the box in this slide, the more species involved. Plants have the largest number of species. Over half of the species are plants. Then you get down to fish, birds. You get in the bottom right corner and it says arachnids. The next box down is the number of species Fish and Wildlife Service looks at. That's terrestrial and freshwater species. And then the National Marine Fisheries Service is in the far right there. I just point that out that there's a lot of species in a lot of places. So when people think it won't impact them, it's going to impact you. There's over 900 species potentially impacted by herbicides and another 900 species potentially impacted by insecticides. So a lot of labels are going to be changing. Next slide, please. I just want to point out the ESA has been successful. There's just some example species that have been saved by this. The Center for Biological Diversity said that 99% of the least listed species are still alive, and over 291 species have been saved or on the road to recovery. So I think the ESA has been quite successful, and species are alive today because of it. Next slide, please. Labels are going to be changing. Um, Only a few labels have changed. I think it's only a dozen labels have changed so far. It's going to take several years for the process to catch up with all labels. And I point that out that users won't have to figure out how to do this for every single pesticide they're using. There's only a handful, only a few will be added every year. So I think that makes it easier for us to adapt and figure out what the requirements are going to be. Next slide, please. I mentioned that there's a whole bunch of endangered species. This is a map of the US and the number of endangered species. So the darker the blue color, the more species. Every county in the continental US has endangered species. So those folks that have told me I don't think this is going to impact me, I'd like to differ with them. I think it's going to impact all of us. Next slide, please. Here's a map from the Festive website, the FIFRA Endangered Species Task Force website. This is Iowa, and the darker the color, the more species. So it goes from about 5 in those white colored counties over to 14 on the far right edge. So all the counties in Iowa have it. They have 18 listed species. This is just a good way to visualize that. Next slide, please. Um, there are some situations where mitigations will not be required, and I like to point this out to the audience because people think, oh my God, my entire operation's going to have to change. I'm going to have to figure out this. There's several characteristics where mitigations will not be required. Some of them are field characteristics, some of them are application methods, and some of them talk about the treated site. So I'm going to go over those in the next slide. One of the things I want to point out is all new labels will be evaluated for endangered species. There's times when we might be able to mitigate some of those, the runoff and erosion and the spray drift, but each state is going to determine how they're going to do this. So it would be good for you to understand your own state regulations. Next slide, please. So there's some field characteristics that don't require mitigation for runoff and erosion. If you have a field site with berms around it, so for example, cranberry fields, some aquatic fields typically have berms around them, you don't have to worry about runoff or erosion. If you have a tailwater return system, if you have subsurface tile drains with a controlled drainage structure, then you don't have to do anything for runoff and erosion mitigation. Next slide, please. Um, there's a number of application methods that don't require mitigations either. So on the left is the application method, on the center is whether it applies to spray drift, and on the right is whether it applies to runoff and erosion. So if you have subsurface chemigation, saying you're doing it underneath a plastic tarp, you don't have to do anything for drift or runoff. If you're doing a tree injection, if you're doing a soil injection, if you're treating small areas less than a tenth of an acre, or you're doing less than 1,000 square feet, you don't have to worry about any mitigations for spray drift or runoff. If you're using drip tape, drip emitters, flood chemigation, you don't have to worry about spray drift. If you're using in-furrow sprays, say you're using an insecticide at planting on top of the seeds, you wouldn't have to worry about spray drift. Tree drench methods, tree trunk painting with a herbicide, you don't have to worry about spray drift. And then solid formulations that are used as a solid, there's no spray drift mitigation either. Next slide, please. And then some sites don't require mitigations, and this is going to be true for both spray drift and runoff and erosion. And I have simplified these down because otherwise they take several slides. The complete list is explained in the mitigation menu, and I'll show you an example of that. So if you have an ag field surrounded by ag fields, surrounded by pasture, what private rangelands, what they're calling managed areas, you don't have to worry about spray drift or runoff. If you have fields, roads around them, gravel surfaces, if you have buildings, silos, man-made structures, if you have vegetative filter strips on the outside of the field, grassed waterways, if you have drift reduction areas such as hedgerows, shelter belts, if you have trees, forests, shrublands next to it. If you have a field surrounded by a conservation reserve program or agricultural conservation easement programs, those you don't need mitigation either. Or if you have an on-farm irrigation system and the area with that returns that water and it's not connected to adjacent water bodies, then you would not have to worry about runoff or erosion mitigations, spray drift or erosion mitigations. Now, I want to point out that these are for Endangered Species Act. There could be label language saying you have to be protective of pollinators or wells or sinkholes or habited structures. So the label should clarify that there are cases where you can't reduce some of these mitigations. And those will be on the same label, but they should be clearly identified. Next slide, please. Where can you find the mitigations? I just want to point out that the mitigations are going to be applied to each field. So you may have to start looking at these on a field or site basis. And that these spray drift and erosion mitigation measures could be different for each pesticide and crop combination. And I'll show you an example of that. So if you think you understand how to use it for a given herbicide, it could change for that herbicide on adjacent crops or within different crops on the same label. Mitigations will appear on up to 3 places on the product label. In the future, it could be on a seed bag tag of treated seed. The label may direct the user to Bulletins Live 2. And it may show a pesticide use limitation area, and they have maps for that. I'll show you one in a minute. Um, and then it may also direct you to the mitigation menu webpage. So there's three places that could give you information on how to protect endangered species. Next slide, please. Um, so pesticide use information, use limitation areas, sorry, they can be found in Bulletins Live 2. I'll show you an example in a second. The EPA, working with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, has identified critical areas to conserve these species. Um, they then drew 1,000-foot ring around that, and that's what developed into the pesticide use limitation areas. If you're going to apply this material in a PULA, you may have to follow additional restrictions, and I'll show you how that works. Um, and as I say, there may be additional mitigations required. Um, in Bulletins Live 2, if it shows that your field is outside of the PULA, I really think it's in your best interest to document that and show that there's no limitations. And in addition, you can check Bulletins Live 2 within 6 months of application. And that's kind of handy because when you're designing your pesticide program for a given field, you can see what limitations you may have, and that helps your selection process, and it also helps your thought process about what you're going to have to do. Um, if you look at Bulletins Live 2, no matter what it says, I encourage everybody to print out a copy of that so you would have it for your records. And it would also tell, if heaven forbid you have an inspection, it would tell the inspector what day you checked the records in case they change at some point. Next slide, please. This is Bulletins Live 2. This is an example from Tennessee. The pink areas have a pesticide use limitation area for dicamba. This is dicamba back in 2025. In those areas, there will be some additional restrictions. So in Bulletins Live 2, you tell them your location, you can tell them your city, your state, you can even use latitude and longitude, you tell them the date, the month you intend to apply the pesticide, and you can actually go and include the pesticide, and sadly you have to use the EPA registration number, but it can give you this level of detail about the PULAs on a map. Next slide, please. On that map, by the way, you can go through and there's an icon on the right that will allow you to click and it will zoom you in on your field and give you a satellite image of it so you can figure out where your field is. So let's say your field is in one of those areas. You click on the field, it will tell you the pesticides that have some restrictions. And in the far right, bottom right, it tells you in text what the limitations are, whether there's additional buffers or timing restrictions or rate restrictions or whatever. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start off talking about spray drift buffers. Um, there's spray drift buffers, there's runoff and erosion mitigations. Spray drift buffers are on a percent scale, and the buffers are downwind only for endangered species. The maximum aerial buffer is 300 feet, the maximum ground is 100 feet, and the maximum air blast or orchard sprayer is 85 feet. The buffers are to protect unmanaged areas, and that list of adjacent fields that I gave you where you wouldn't have to do any mitigation is because in general, they think that most ag fields don't have endangered species on them. In general, it's the adjacent area. There's 15 ways to reduce buffer distances for ground applications. Um, And remember, some of these buffers are for more than just ESA, and there could be additional language saying when you can't mitigate those distances. I'm going to show you some hypothetical examples. It's not a complete list of options, but I tried to pick some relevant ones. Next slide, please. And I mentioned labels are starting to change. Here's an example with Liberty Ultra, glufosinate P herbicide. In addition to labels changing in the future, this one has changed. They're just released a supplemental label talking about drift reducing adjuvants. They clarified the aerial percent is 2.5%. And for example, with ground applications, if you use a 0.3% volume of a drift reducing adjuvant and use a low boom height, there's no buffer required. So sometimes following these, in this case, gets you to zero buffer pretty quickly. Um, so some other buffers could be unidirectional. Some of the older labels said that, but these buffers for ESA are downwind only. Um, so on that label, it talks about an aerial spray drift buffer of 50 feet. You have to use medium droplet size, and there's only 3 ways to reduce the distance. For ground spray buffers, it's 10 feet with medium to coarser droplet size required, and there's only 4 ways to reduce the buffer distance. This particular herbicide has 3 runoff and erosion points and tells you have to check bulletins live too. Um, if you look at for Tento, the insecticide label, spray drift buffers are 300 feet for aerial, 25 feet for ground, overhead chemigation is 25 feet, air blast is 85 feet. So depending on how you apply it, you have different buffers. The label says it requires medium or coarser droplet size for both aerial and ground. Um, refers you to the spray drift mitigation menu for ways to reduce the buffer distance. There are some buffers to areas occupied for humans, and those cannot be reduced. So this is an example where the label says you can't reduce some of these distances. Like Liberty Ultra, you have to check bulletins live too. And this one, we use this as an example because for runoff and erosion, depending on what crop you're treating or what site, there's either 2 points, 4 points, or 6 points for runoff and erosion. So not only the pesticide matter, but what crop you're using it on matters as well. Next slide, please. Here's an example from Acre Blitz, which is a commercial company that allows you to produce maps and has a whole bunch of really great things they can do for you. Um, in this example, there's an orange area, that's a canal, and that would be an area that needs to be protected. Um, there's a red line, and that's the 300-foot buffer between that and managed areas. There's a yellow line, that's the 75-foot buffer, and the blue arrow is, in our example, the wind direction. So in this case, we're saying it's a ground applied insecticide. Winds are about 8 miles per hour. The label says you can't apply if it's more than 15 miles an hour, and the boom height is 4 feet. So the label requires an 85-foot buffer, medium droplet size. How can I reduce the 85-foot buffer? So if you were to use a coarse droplet size, and I'll go through this example a bit differently, using a coarser droplet size gets you a 40% reduction. If you reduce the rate by 25%, say you've gotten effective control at a lower than the maximum rate, you could get a 25% reduction, and you get points if the relative humidity is greater than 60%. So in this case, you'd get 75% reduction in the buffer. So the new buffer would be 21.25 feet. The instructions tell you to round off to the nearest 5 feet. So the new buffer is now 20 feet. So that was a substantial reduction in buffer. And I think it will make it much easier to use these products. Next slide, please. Um, I- we've developed what we call a general strategy for achieving drift buffer reductions. There's some things that aren't going to change very often. So we suggest checking those too. So for example, item one is check for exemptions to the mitigation option. If you're using an application method that's exempt, that probably won't change. Site characteristics, if you have a long area of managed area between you and unmanaged areas, that probably won't change. I do remind people to think about distance to an unmanaged area because is the wind direction going to matter to that? And then the next thing to think about is do you have windbreaks, hedgerows, trees, woodlands adjacent to you? Both of those won't change often. So think about those first. And then if you still need more reduction, think about droplet size, lowering the boom height. Drift reducing adjuvants can help. Currently, they're only allowed for herbicides, but we're hoping those will be allowed soon for insecticides and fungicides as well, and that would be a great tool for all of us, etc. So anyway, think about the things that don't change very often. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through some examples the from a ground mitigation or a ground application. So the first thing, if you reduce the single application rate, if you have a 10% reduction in rate, you can do this through banded application, or maybe you can use a lower rate. If you have a 10% reduction in rate, you get a 10% reduction in the distance. If you have a high boom and your droplet goes from fine to medium, you get a 75% drop. If you have a droplet size, if you go from a fine to a coarse, you have an 85% drop in distance. With low boom, going to larger droplet size gets you from a 50 to an 85% reduction in distance. If you use a hooded sprayer, over the top or the row middles, you can get a reduction. If you use drop nozzles, for example, you can get a 50% reduction. If you use spray drift reducing adjuvants, pardon me, currently it's only for herbicides. And it also assumes you're starting at a fine droplet size. If you go from that fine size to a medium droplet size, you get a 30% reduction. If you're already using coarse or very coarse droplets and you add a drift reducing adjuvant, you get a 15% reduction because those larger droplets are already not as prone to drift as Greg was pointing out. Next slide, please. Um, if we reduce the proportion of field treated, say for example, you've got an insect problem, it's coming in from an adjacent area, and maybe you only need to make one or two pass application on that edge of the field, you can get anywhere from a 75% to a 15% reduction, depending on how little of the field you treat. If you have windbreaks, trees, woodlands, forest adjacent to it, you can get anywhere from a 50 to 100% reduction. And then again, if your relative humidity is 60% or more at the time of application, you can get a 10% reduction. All of these, when we show you the example from the mitigation menu, they all have very specific definitions, and you can link to those when you use the mitigation menu for those very specific definitions. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a 50-foot buffer requirement. On the far right, on the top, it shows a stream and a tree. In this case, there's a 20-foot windbreak, um, a conservation reserve program land of 10 feet. In this case, because the user did nothing to reduce the buffer, they have 20 feet in the field that can't be sprayed. In the next example, just below that, you have the same stream and tree. However, the windbreak is 30 feet and the conservation reserve program land is 20 feet. That gives them the 50 feet, and now they can spray all the way to the edge of the field. Next slide, please. This is the spray drift mitigation calculator. I'm going to walk you through the questions and then at the end I'll summarize it again. But I thought it would be nice to show people this. So I've got an example in Frederick County, Maryland, where I live. The user is going to plant soybeans, um, and there's a 100-foot buffer on the label. So on the left side is all those conditions I mentioned where you don't have to have any mitigations at all. That's pretty clearly listed here on the mitigation menu. And in addition, if you click on that box on the left, it will take you to written definitions with a few illustrations of those areas, those managed areas, those situations where you do not need to do any mitigation. So you can hyperlink to all those descriptions. Next slide, please. The next thing is you go to the field and it asks you in the upper left to enter the buffer distance 100 feet. I've told it I'm using a medium droplet, that the label requires a medium droplet. Down below that, I said I'm using a high boom, which describes it as greater than 24 inches above the ground. The single max use rate is 19 ounces. I'm going at 16, so I'll get a reduction for that. If you go to the next table to the right, up at the top, it says we're getting a 16% reduction in the buffer distance. About halfway down, I said I'm using drift reducing agent, and we get a 30% reduction for that. And then down at the bottom, it says relative humidity is 60% or more, and we get 10 points for that. Next slide, please. So I'm just re-summarizing this because the text can be bigger. It's a little easier to read. So we get a 16% reduction for the rate, 30% reduction for the DRA, a 10% reduction for relative humidity. So the buffer would be 56% lower. You add up the percents. Don't multiply a percent of a percent. You just add those percents up. So it's 45 feet. And I've rounded because the actual calculation is 44 feet and it says to round to the nearest five. Um, if the buffer had been less than 10 feet, then you don't have to do anything. No ESA mitigation would have been needed. If you need a smaller buffer, you can reduce the area treated. You can use larger droplets. Potentially there's a windbreak. There's 15 different ways on a ground application to reduce the buffer distance. Next slide, please. Now, there's also cases where you're going to put more than one product in a tank. And I bet you a nickel that's virtually every application. You have more than one product in the tank. So here's an example with product A. It has a 50-foot buffer. Product B has a 30-foot buffer. And product C doesn't have any buffer listed. You use 50 feet. Use the longest distance. Don't add up these distances. Oh my God, I can only imagine if you had a five-way mix. If you added them, it would be impossible. So you use the largest number. Let's say in this example, you're going to get a 50% reduction because you happen to be able to use a hooded sprayer, a 10% reduction for relative humidity, a 15% reduction for reduced proportion of the field treated. The buffer would be 75 feet, that's or 75% lower. So it's 50 plus 10 plus 15. So that works out to 12 feet. They tell you to round to the nearest 10. So, excuse me, round to the nearest 5. So that would be a 10-foot buffer. Next slide, please. Runoff and erosion. Runoff and erosion is point-based, not a percent, just so you can sort of keep these separate. And again, the idea is anything we can do to keep the pesticide on the field is very important, and that's what we'd like to do. some of the language we're going to start seeing on labels is reminding people do not apply when soils are saturated or above field capacity. Don't apply during the rain. Um, the insecticide strategy has cases where insects will be on the field, so there may be some different mitigations for insects than we might see on herbicide labels. Um, and again, there's different ways to protect adjacent areas, and I'll go into those. Next slide, please. I just wanted to point out there's been a couple surveys recently looking at can growers even get 9 points. This scale is a 0 to 9 scale for mitigation points. American Soybean Association survey last year, 100% of the respondents said they would have 3 points with their current practice without doing any change at all. 96% said they would have 6 points without changing any practices. 71% said they would have 9 points without changing any practices. There was another survey done by BASF, and they were looking at corn, cotton, and soybeans. Again, 100% of the respondents would have 3 points. 97 to 99%, depending on the crop, would have 6 points, and 69 to 72% of the respondents, depending on the crop, would have 9 points. I just want to point that out that for a lot of people, you can get 6 points without making any change in your current production practices. So I think a lot of this is really doable, and I just want to point that out to people. Next slide, please. Mitigation for runoff. Again, this is a point system. The idea and the intention is to protect downslope this material from getting there. The EPA has data showing these pesticides can move up to 1,000 feet. So that's where their concern is. There were 15 ways to reduce spray drift. There's 40 ways to reduce runoff and erosion mitigations, or mitigation for runoff and erosion. Next slide, please. We have a general strategy for runoff and erosion points as well. And we suggest starting with items 1 through 4 because they don't change very often. Check for exemptions from mitigation, those first exemption characteristics I talked about. In addition, I'm going to show you in a second, many counties have relief points. They don't have much rainfall. The agency thinks they have a very low chance of having runoff and erosion. And some counties get up to 6 points. That's not going to change. You can get points if your slope is less than 3%. Well, your slope isn't going to change very often. You can get points if you have a predominantly sandy soil, and the mitigation menu very carefully describes what that is. But your soil type isn't going to change often. Your cropping practices won't change. If you're not irrigating, you get 3 points. If you're under no-till or reduced tillage, you get points. If you have grassed waterways, you get points. So all those won't change often. We suggest people go in and start looking at those characteristics first when you start considering points. Next slide, please. I talked about runoff vulnerability relief points. In this map, it includes all the counties in the US. The EPA has a link and they go through and list every county for every state so you can look up your county. The dark brown color has a very low chance of erosion. They get 6 points. The light brown areas have a low chance, and they get 4 relief points. The light green gets 2 relief points, and the dark green gets no relief points. So, for example, if you're in a dark brown area, before you do anything at all, you start out with 6 points for those fields. So some places this will be much easier than to get enough points than others. Next slide, please. This is a map of the number of relief points per county in Iowa, just to show that they're graphically displayed as well. And this is from AcreBlitz. Next slide. The runoff and erosion mitigation fall into categories, and I want to point that out. So the first one is location. Are you going to get county points? The next one is in-field measures, things like conservation, tillage, cover crops. Field adjacent measures gets you points, vegetative filter strips, vegetative ditches. Field characteristics, I talked about slope and soil texture. Um, then there's other mitigation points for mitigation tracking, and if you're working with a technical specialist, and then finally you can get pesticide specific points. I point this out because if you're getting points for more than one of these categories, you get an extra point because you're doing things with multiple categories. Next slide, please. Um, There's 40 of these, so I'll try and go through them quickly. You can get points if you have a low slope, less than 3%, predominantly sandy soils, you get points. The EPA is developing qualified conservation programs. If you're operating in one of those programs, you can get up to 9 points, which means you could use any pesticide and you would be taken care of. Next slide, please. Annual application rate reduction. Instead of getting a percent reduction, they have categories here, so you can go 1 to 3 points. Reduction in the proportion of field treated, you can get 2 to 4 points. If you use soil incorporation on a product that doesn't require it, you can get a point. Next slide, please. In-field mitigation measures. Conservation tillage, vegetative filter strips in the field, irrigation water management. Now, this one's important because if you're non-irrigated, dry farming, non-irrigated lands, you get 3 points. So some of the field crops are not irrigated. They start off with 3 points. If you've got a soil applied pesticide and you use an anionic polyacrylamide, you can get 2 points for that. That material helps hold the pesticide on the soil particles. If you have a cover crop, you can get points for that, different points depending on how late the cover crop is terminated and how intensive the cover crop is. Next slide, please. Field adjacent measures such as grassed waterways, vegetative filter strips, vegetative ditches. You can get points for a whole wealth of categories there as well. Next slide, please. If you have systems to capture water, that way you don't have to worry about that runoff going off your field or off your farm. You can get points for those as well. Next slide, please. And then other, if you do mitigation tracking, if, for example, you go into the mitigation menu and go through the practice, you get a point for that. If you're working with a technical expert to reduce runoff, you get 2 points for that. If you use mitigation measures from multiple categories, you get a point for that too. So there's other ways to get points. Next slide, please. And here's an example of a field. This is from Acre Blitz. In this example, the soil types are different colors. The yellow lines are contours. The average slope is 5% in this field. It does not have predominantly sandy loam soil, so it gets no points for that. In this particular case, doing nothing at all, you get 1 point for mitigation tracking, and you get 2 points because it's a reduced tillage system. Uh, anyway, just to show you some of these programs that can help you look at your individual field situation. Next slide, please. Here's an example from the mitigation calculator. Again, it has the categories where you don't have to do anything. In my example, I'm saying it's a soybean ground application requiring 6 runoff mitigation points. And again, there's a hyperlink to all the descriptions of any of these in the mitigation calculator. Next slide, please. In my case, I'm in Frederick County, Maryland, and it shows 2 points because of the runoff vulnerability category. I'm tracking mitigation because I'm filling out the worksheet, so I get a point for that. I'm following the recommendations from a specialist that looks at runoff and erosion, so I get a point for that. Next slide. And in my example, I don't have sandy soil and I have a lot of slope, so I don't get any points for those. So on this one, it's conservation tillage. I get 2 points for that. I have vegetative filter strips in my field example. I get 2 points for that. I have a cover crop. I get 2 points for that. Irrigation water management, it's dry farming, so I get 3 points for that. I have vegetative filter strips around the edge of the field. Because of the slope, I get a point for that. Next slide. And I'm using multiple mitigation measures, so I get a point for that. So in here it says I'm at 15 points. Next slide. And then again, the spreadsheet points out that you've got 15 points, and that's great for your records. Next slide, please. So I'm just reiterating the results. I get points for vulnerability relief points, for tracking, for following the recommendations of an erosion specialist, conservation tillage, vegetative strips in the field, 3 points because it's non-irrigated, and a point for mitigations from multiple categories. If you needed additional points, you could reduce the percent of the field treated, reduce the annual use rate, etc. Next slide. And again, we wanted to go through an example with multiple products. Here we have product A requires 6 runoff points, product B requires 3, product C doesn't list any. You use the largest number, do not add these points. So in this case, my example is I'm getting 2 points for runoff vulnerability relief points because of the county. It's non-irrigated. Farmland, I get 3 points. I have a cover crop, I get 3 points. I have a vegetative ditch, I get a point. I get a point for mitigation for multiple categories and 1 point for tracking mitigation. So 11 points in my example. Next slide, please. In conclusion, I just want to recommend everybody work collaboratively. This is going to take work between the user, crop consultants, sales reps, and the state. The ESA process is very new and still evolving. It's only on a few labels. This is a great time to start figuring this out. Um, Growers will have to look at the ESA on a field by field basis. These changes, as I said, are going to take several years. Also, this is a good time to see if there's state-specific information or a contact person in your state you might want to find so you can start having these discussions. Next slide, please. Um, and and there's a whole bunch of resources and websites available. So the EPA has websites. The Weed Science Society of America that I'm dealing with has definitions, handouts, presentations, compliance services. I showed you some of their maps for protected species. FIFRA Endangered Species Task Force has some great maps that list the ESA species, how many per county. It's also got starting to track how many pesticides have these requirements on them. So they're actively tracking that. Um, the pesticide stewardship website has great information for pesticide trainers. Acre Blitz, I showed you some of their nice maps. And then CPDA, I want to put a plug in for their great toolbox. They have some videos, they have some great information for people to use. Next slide, and I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Greg and Bill for a great presentation today. We'd also like to thank Winfield United for sponsoring today's webinar. I'm going to go ahead and put the QR code up for your CCA CEU and also pull up the chat panel to see what kind of questions we have. First question of the day. Um, Let's see. Oh, it says the chat's disabled. You can put it in the chat if the Q&A is not working for you. First question, how is compliance going to be enforced or checked, and how frequently will it be checked?
That that's a great question. In speaking to the state lead agencies, they're still trying to figure out their role and get their training developed and all that. Several states that I've spoken to said in general, they only get involved if there's a complaint call. So at which time they will come in and start looking at records. So that they're trying to develop their approach to this as well. They're trying to get their folks trained and figure out how they're going to deal with this too.
Next question for Greg. Can you explain again why we should include a deposition aid in all spray solutions, and how do we justify the cost for the grower when crop prices are so low this year?
So that's a great question. So one of the things you actually do get with using a DRA with the nozzle that you select is that you will get more product where you want it to be. I do realize that these adjuvants are pretty expensive, and then as we mentioned at the last webinar, they pay for themselves really well if it's a post-emergence application of a herbicide, insecticide, fungicide, and then if you put it out as a like a pre or a residual spray, we don't get as much benefit from those in that situation. But anything going out post, an awful lot of those applications, adding that high-priced DRA will actually pay for itself. And then the flip side of it is you've got less product going off target where you're either losing it or you might have some situation where you get drift damage or things like that.
Bill, can you explain again how to determine if a field site that does not require mitigation, or if it does, and what's a managed area?
So great question. Thank you. The mitigation menu on the EPA website has definitions of all that, and it's kind of a lengthy definition you'll have to read through. But the mitigation website on the EPA website walks you through that and how to figure out if you have managed areas that don't require any mitigation.
Uh, next question is, what are the three places to look to determine mitigation requirements?
Good question. Thank you. The label will give requirements, the bulletins live too, BLT, and then the mitigation menu. And going to the label can direct you to either BLT two or to the mitigation menu.
Next question. Using the Liberty Ultra example, can you explain again how to use DRAs to eliminate the mandatory downwind 10-foot buffer?
Yes. If you go to, I believe for a ground rig, if you put in a 0.3% solution of an approved DRA, and then I think it's a low boom height, you have a zero buffer on that application. So that's a great tool for reducing that buffer to something that you don't have to worry about.
I agree.
Next question. Who instructs the registrants of the changes needed on their labels?
That would be that the labels are owned by the registrant, but they're done in negotiations with the EPA. So the EPA explains to them what's going on the label, and I have seen some labels being held up, and clearly because the agency is trying to figure out for themselves what has to go on the labels too,
Right,
and
right.
describe that to the registrants.
All right. It looks like that's the end of our questions for today. I want to once again thank Greg and Bill and the folks at CPDA, including their advisory working group, on putting together such a great series of webinars for both ARA and CPDA. This was scheduled to be our final webinar of the series for this year. However, we are in talks with maybe doing one more extra bonus webinar, given the recent decisions made by EPA. So please stay tuned for more information on a possible next webinar. In the meantime, I want to remind you that you can go to aradc.org and go to the webinar page and view past webinars if you would like to view those. And again, thanks to CPDA for great information. The resources they have available at CPDA.com are just fantastic. So again, thanks to Greg, Bill, Terry, and the team at CPDA. Appreciate everything you do. Thanks
Great.
again from your friends here at ARA.
Thank you.
Thank you.